The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Hargreave & Sons building had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Toronto. And on a clear day you could see Lake Ontario, stretching out to the horizon like a sheet of hammered silver. It was a beautiful room. Loretta Marchetti had cleaned it every Monday morning for 6 years before anyone in that building ever bothered to learn her last name. She stood at the far end of the long mahogany table now, not as the woman who used to empty the recycling bins along the corridor, but as the person the Hargreave family's own lawyer had just introduced as the sole beneficiary of the Marchetti-Osi Commercial Trust, a real estate holding company with assets in 4 provinces and a market valuation that the lawyer, a careful man named Fenwick, had taken a long breath before reading aloud. Nobody laughed. But they had been laughing, not 5 minutes earlier. That part is worth going back to. Loretta was 31 years old when she walked into that building for the last time, as someone other people felt comfortable underestimating. She had taken the elevator to the 42nd floor just as she always had. Sensible flats, hair pulled back, a blazer she'd bought second-hand from a consignment shop on Queen Street West. She carried a leather portfolio that her aunt had given her years ago. It was worn at the corners. She had never replaced it. The meeting had been called by Edmund Hargreave Jr., the eldest son of the company's founder, to settle the question of the Pemberton Street properties, a cluster of commercial buildings in the Distillery District that his late father had acquired decades ago, and that had since become some of the most sought-after real estate in the city. Edmund Jr. had assumed, as he assumed most things, that the matter was already decided. His family owned the buildings. The buildings would be sold. The proceeds would go to the estate. This was the natural order of things. What he had not accounted for was Loretta. She had been invited to the meeting in a technical sense. Her name appeared on a letter of notification that Fenwick's office had sent out 3 weeks prior, because her name appeared on documents that Edmund Jr. had not, until very recently, taken the time to read carefully. He assumed she was there as a formality, a loose end to be managed. He had said as much to his younger brother Warren in the hallway outside, not bothering to lower his voice. "She's a cleaner," he'd said. "Whatever Dad put in her name, we'll sort it out. Get Fenwick to explain the numbers to her slowly." Warren had smiled in the way he always smiled. Just enough to agree without committing. Loretta had heard every word. She was standing 6 feet away by the window, looking out at the lake. She didn't turn around. She had grown up in Scarborough, the daughter of a Ghanaian father and a Calabrian mother, which meant she had spent most of her childhood being too much of one thing and not quite enough of another, depending on whose kitchen she was standing in. Her father, Emmanuel, had worked in property management his whole adult life. Not as an owner, but as the man who fixed the boilers and dealt with the tenants and kept meticulous records in notebooks he stored in shoeboxes under his bed. He understood property the way a doctor understands the body, not from owning it but from knowing exactly how it worked and what happened when something went wrong. He taught Loretta everything he knew, not in a formal way. There were no lessons, no whiteboard, no assigned reading. It happened over dinner, over drives to Home Depot on Saturday mornings, over years of listening to him talk about vacancy rates and lease structures and what a building was actually worth versus what someone was asking for it. By the time Loretta finished her undergraduate degree in economics at Ryerson, paying her way through with a combination of scholarships, part-time work, and a stubbornness she had inherited from both sides of her family, she could look at a commercial property listing and see things that most people with twice her experience would miss. Her father died in her second year of university. A heart attack, sudden and complete, on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He was 54. Loretta took 2 weeks off and then went back to class. She had no other option. The mortgage on the family house in Scarborough was in her name now, co-signed 6 months before his death when her parents had refinanced, and her mother was working reduced hours at the hospital where she'd been a lab technician for 20 years. There was no room for falling apart. She filed that away for later, and later became a very long time. She graduated. She got a job at a commercial real estate firm downtown, a junior analyst position that paid well enough and offered her access to data she found genuinely interesting. She was good at the work. She was also, as it turned out, very difficult for certain people to take seriously. And in an industry built on relationships and the performance of confidence, that mattered more than she had anticipated. The firm was run by a man named Clifton Hargreave. He was Edmund Sr.'s cousin, not his son, and he operated a smaller subsidiary under the Hargreave name. He was the first person in a professional setting who actually listened when Loretta spoke. Not because he was particularly progressive or generous. Clifton was neither of those things in any meaningful way, but because he was practical, and Loretta kept being right. when she flagged an undervalued block of properties in Parkdale in her third month on the job and laid out a 5-year projection that showed a return of nearly 300%. Clifton had looked at her across his desk for a long moment and then said, "How old are you?" 24, she said. He nodded slowly as if adjusting to new information. "Who did you learn this from?" "My father," she said. "He managed buildings." Clifton bought the Parkdale properties. He made a significant amount of money. He also, without ever quite saying so directly, began to mentor Loretta in the ways the industry actually worked. Not the theory, but the relationships, the timing, the patience required to hold something long enough for it to become what you knew it could be. He introduced her to Edmund Sr. at a lunch 2 years later. Edmund Sr. was 73, recently widowed and possessed of the particular clarity that sometimes comes to people who have accumulated enough that they no longer need to pretend. He looked at Loretta for about 30 seconds and then said, "You're the one who found the Parkdale block." "Yes," she said. "Clifton tells me you have an eye. I pay attention," she said. Edmund Sr. smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. That's rarer than people think. He hired her away from Clifton's subsidiary 8 months later. A move that caused a friction between the two cousins that neither of them ever fully resolved. Edmund Sr. didn't particularly care. He was reorganizing his affairs, he told Loretta, and he wanted someone around who would tell him the truth about what his portfolio actually looked like rather than what his sons wanted it to look like. His sons wanted it to look like it belonged to them. That was the shape of things. Edmund Jr. was 47, and had spent his entire adult life working in and around his father's company, without ever quite running it the way he believed he should. He was not incompetent. He was, in fact, reasonably capable when it came to the parts of the business he understood. But he had a specific blindness to the parts he didn't understand, and he covered that blindness with a certainty that other people often mistook for confidence. Warren, 6 years younger, had more social intelligence and less ambition, which meant he mostly followed his brother's lead and tried not to get caught in the crossfire. Neither of them knew what to make of Loretta. She was not a threat they recognized. She had been brought on as a senior analyst and worked directly with Edmund Sr. for nearly 4 years. During that time, she identified 3 separate acquisition opportunities that the company had been about to walk away from and restructured the lease arrangements on the Pemberton Street properties in a way that had, by conservative estimates, increased their value by 60%. She did this quietly, methodically, without making a point of announcing it. Edmund Sr. noticed. Edmund Jr. occasionally received credit for it in meetings, because it was easier for everyone to let that happen than to have the conversation about why it was happening. Loretta was paid well. She was not made a partner. She was not given equity. These were not oversights. She didn't complain. She observed and she planned, and she had a series of very careful conversations with Edmund Sr. in the last year of his life, when he had begun to understand that his heart was not going to outlast his intentions. What came out of those conversations was the Marchetti O.C. Commercial Trust, a structure that Loretta and a lawyer she trusted had helped Edmund Sr. establish quietly, over the course of 18 months, in a way that was entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely invisible to everyone who hadn't been in the room when it was signed. The trust held the Pemberton Street properties. It was administered by an independent trustee, and Loretta Marchetti was named as the beneficial owner upon Edmund Sr.'s death, in recognition of, as the founding document stated in language the old man had chosen himself, her honesty, her competence, and her willingness to tell me things I needed to hear rather than things I wanted to. Edmund Sr. died in the spring, 14 months after signing the trust documents. He died at home on a Saturday morning, which was how he had said he wanted to go. His sons found out about the Pemberton Street Trust approximately 3 weeks later. Edmund Jr. had called the meeting with a specific intention: to demonstrate, with Fenwick present and the paperwork in hand, that the trust was either invalid or could be contested on grounds of undue influence. He had spent those 3 weeks being very angry and making phone calls to lawyers, and the lawyers had told him, with varying degrees of directness, that the document was clean. He had not entirely accepted this. He had also spent those 3 weeks constructing a version of the story in which Loretta was the villain, someone who had manipulated a dying old man, who had used her access and his deteriorating judgment to take something that rightfully belonged to the family. He told this version to Warren. He told it to his wife. He told it to anyone who would listen. By the time he walked into that conference room, he believed it completely. Loretta knew this. She knew it the way she knew most things, not because anyone had told her, but because she paid attention, and the signs were not subtle. She had brought her own counsel. A woman named Price, who was very calm and very expensive and who had reviewed every document related to the trust multiple times. Price sat beside Loretta at the far end of the table, with a stack of folders and the particular expression of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the other side to realize it. Edmund Jr. arrived with Fenwick and with Warren and with a third lawyer Loretta didn't recognize, someone brought in at the last minute, probably as a show of force. He also arrived with a specific kind of confidence, which was the confidence of a man who had never had a room not go his way, and had therefore concluded that rooms did not go other ways. He didn't greet Loretta. He looked at her once, very briefly, and then looked away. He sat down at the head of the table, not the head closest to her, but the other head, the one that faced the door, and he spread his papers out in the manner of someone establishing territory. "I think we all know why we're here," he said. "We're here," Price said in a pleasant voice, "to review the trust documentation and discuss the transfer of the Pemberton Street assets." "We're here," Edmund Jr. said, "because my father was not well in the last year of his life, and certain people took advantage of that." The third lawyer, the one Loretta didn't recognize, put his hand flat on the table in a way that seemed intended to be authoritative. "We have serious concerns about the circumstances under which this trust was established." Warren said nothing. He was looking at the view. Loretta folded her hands on the table. She didn't respond. She was his employee. Edmund Jr. continued, now addressing Fit rather than Loretta as if she weren't there. She had access to his finances, his schedule, his medical information. In the last 18 months of his life, she was present at more of his meetings than his own family was. He paused. "That's not a coincidence." Fenwick, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He had been Edmund Sr.'s lawyer for 30 years. He knew the old man. He knew that Edmund Sr. had been sharp until the end, sharp and deliberate and not given to sentiment. He had also been present at the signing of the trust documents and had, in fact, reviewed them himself. Edmund Fenwick said carefully, "The trust documents are." "I'm aware of what the documents say," Edmund Jr. said. "I'm questioning the conditions under which they were produced." Price opened one of her folders. She did it without any particular urgency. "We anticipated this concern," she said, "and we've prepared a comprehensive record of the circumstances." She slid a bound document to the center of the table. Edmund Jr. didn't reach for it immediately. "The trust was established over a period of 18 months, Price continued. Mr. Hargreaves Sr. met with his physician on 4 separate occasions during that period for cognitive assessments, all of which confirmed full capacity. He met with Mr. Fenwick's office to review the documents on 3 occasions. He also," she slid a second document across, "wrote a letter which has been notarized, explaining his reasoning in his own words." Edmund Jr. looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. "The Pemberton Street properties," Price said, "are held in the Marchetti O.C. Commercial Trust and have been legally transferred to Ms. Marchetti, as of the date of Edmund Hargreaves Sr.'s death. There is no legal ground for contest." She paused. "However, if you'd prefer to explore that avenue, we're prepared." There was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Warren finally looked away from the window. He looked at his brother. He looked at Loretta. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost private, he said, "How long?" Loretta looked at him. It was the first time she'd looked directly at either of the brothers since she sat down. "How long have you known about this?" Warren asked. "Since Edmund Sr. and I discussed it," she said, "about 2.5 years ago." Warren nodded once. Something passed across his face, not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. "He trusted you," he said. "He did," Loretta said. "I tried to deserve it." Edmund Jr. said nothing. His jaw was set. He was looking at the notarized letter, which was written in his father's particular slanted handwriting, and whatever he was reading there had closed something off in his face. The third lawyer gathered his papers. "We'll need time to review." "Of course," Price said. What happened next was not dramatic, in the way that people sometimes imagine these things go. There was no shouting, no overturned chairs. Edmund Jr. stood up and left the room without speaking again, and Warren followed him, and the third lawyer followed Warren. Fenwick stayed behind long enough to shake Loretta's hand and say, very quietly, "He knew what he was doing, you know, Edmund Sr. He was not confused about any of it." "I know," Loretta said. "He talked about you," Fenwick said, "in the last year. He said," he paused as if choosing whether to say, "he said you reminded him of himself before money made him careful." Loretta didn't respond to that for a moment. She looked down at her worn leather portfolio on the table. Her aunt had given it to her at university graduation, pressed into her hands outside the Ryerson ceremony with the words, "Keep showing up." "Thank you," she said. Fenwick nodded and left. The Pemberton Street properties, in the months that followed, became the foundation of something Loretta had been building slowly and quietly in the background for years. a real estate development company focused on mixed-use properties in communities that most developers had historically ignored. She brought in 2 partners, both women she had known from her analyst days, both of whom had encountered the same ceilings and found, independently, the same workarounds. They named the company after her father's initials and a street in Scarborough. She did not do press releases about any of this. She did not post about it. She continued to wear sensible shoes and buy her blazers secondhand, and take the subway downtown rather than drive, because those were the habits that had kept her clear-headed when it mattered, and she saw no reason to change them now. Edmund Jr. attempted a legal challenge, which ran into the same walls that Fenwick and every other lawyer had already described. It was quietly withdrawn 18 months later. Warren sent Loretta an email, about 6 months after the meeting, that was 2 sentences long. I looked at the Parkdale projections you did back in 2017. I understand now what Myfar saw in you. She read it twice and then filed it away without responding. Not out of bitterness. She had spent a long time carefully not being bitter, because she had observed that bitterness made you slow, but because there was nothing left to say. Edmund Sr. had seen her when she was 24 years old, sitting across a desk in a building where she knew every maintenance corridor and every broken elevator, and he had recognized something. She had tried to deserve it. She had spent nearly a decade proving that the recognition was right. That was the whole story. That was all of it. The rest was just what happened next, which was hers to decide.